Interdimensional War by Dagaan Galakticos. Chapter 5. Journal entry, December 4, 2004, 2:14 a.m. I returned almost an hour ago now. I've been lying in the dark, trying to absorb what just happened. I just had sex. No, made real love with a woman from Ovvala. Luev. That's her name. It was the woman I saw at the market, the woman who looked at me. I can barely breathe. My chest is burning. I feel like I'm expanding, stretching. Is this enlightenment? She's so exotic. I close my eyes and I can see her face. Sea green eyes looking back at me as though she's right there inside my forehead. It's her cottage by the big boulder. I'm running it all together. I should start at the beginning. I went out the back of my neck, across the dark space, through the ocean of blue waves, and through the oval door. A small ball, a pearl, of that same blue remained in my field of vision, and I followed it over the grove of evergreens to the cottages and came to the cottage by the boulder with a lump of quartz on it. I felt pulled toward the house and drifted through a door, still following the promptings of the blue pearl. I found myself in a bedroom. Someone was sleeping in the wide, low bed. It was very still, dark, and quiet. There were embroidered curtains on the windows and a shiny black lacquered bureau and a table with a lamp by the bed. I was standing on a wooden floor. I could smell a clean, pleasant smell. It was feminine, like a mix of milk and clean laundry and something else, a flower smell. As I stood watching, wondering why I was there, the energy body of a woman rose up out of the sleeping form and stood up on the bed. She was completely naked and half asleep. The uniqueness of her body, of her motions as she steadied herself on the bed, were so different than human that I was hypnotized and just stood there, forgetting to breathe, and watched her. She sensed me standing at the foot of the bed, and we locked eyes. Neither of us was prepared at that moment for an encounter with someone, and our senses were wide open. One of her feet was going through her sleeping body on the bed, but she was oblivious to this. She became more aware of her arm, and her arm lifted in self-protection. She was wearing only a gauzy robe that concealed about as much of her as would a wet Kleenex. I hadn't yet looked at an Ovvalan of any kind, up close, much less a naked woman. The curve of her hips was slightly different than a human woman's. Her waist seemed higher. Her hair had a life of its own. It writhed slowly and seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The long slope of her waist leading to her oval breasts was surrealistic and out of time, like an old album cover. I felt overwhelmed. The piercing intelligence in her eyes and the alien vitality of her naked, vulnerable body had me locked in wonder. She couldn't have been more unique if she had had the head and paws of a cheetah. There was a distinct telepathy between us. It was eerie. The beginning of every thought of either of us was immediately neutralized by a responsive thought in the other. We stared at each other for the longest time, unable to take our eyes away, stop the telepathy, or cause the communication to add up to something. As I looked, a blue pearl of light on her forehead winked out, and I realized it had been there all along, coming through the louche. I realized that this is where it had been leading. I felt my own forehead glow with warmth. The vanishing of the blue pearl made me realize she was the woman I had seen at the market cafe. Her face and movements had crossed my mind a number of times since the incident. Did I somehow magnetize this encounter through my subconscious? Does she exist outside my subconscious? Is this all dream invention? We stared at each other, knowing we were alien life forms to one another. I saw her features up close and clearly, the soft plane of her cheek, the mold of her chin, the curve of her forehead, the elf-like oval of her face, her glowing green eyes. One tapered ear stuck up through her glowing hair. Present at the same time as one another's alienness was sex, an intense magnetism between us kept the alienness of our forms and vibes from becoming frightening. Our being sexy to each other was our one point of familiarity, a common language. Her eyes curved delicately in a slant, expressing the deep, volatile emotions I remembered feeling from other Ovvalans at the cafe, a kind of latent hysteria. Involuntarily I stepped nearer, controlled by the magnetism of her presence. Her hair, up close and in the dark, had a snaky, living luster. It writhed in slow motion as she'd risen out of her body and sensually slid off her shoulders as she stood shakily on the bed. As I continued to stare at her, an opaque, creamy light covered her nakedness like a milky light. Desire took me over like a compass pointing in one direction. It was desire laced with a kind of suspended fear. Also, I felt I was having a spiritual vision and didn't know if feeling such desire was completely appropriate. In a dreamlike way, I was fully conscious of what was going on, even though I was overwhelmed by the strangeness. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was low and came out of her belly like a growl. She was speaking mentally, intensely excited. Her voice vibrated and hummed, transmitted through an electric current straight into my brain. "I am Joe," I said. "Joe?" She hugged herself protectively. Even in this mental communication, she heard my foreign accent, and it disturbed her even more than she already was. She looked around the room to see if there were others like me. She became more awake, and her robes became more opaque. An unleashed electric current continued shooting between us. With long animal strides, she stepped off the bed and circled the room. "You are not Ovvalan," she said accusingly. I could feel her skin become electrified, almost horror-stricken. All the hair on my own body stood up in response. I felt my face molting and changing. "I'm from Santa Fe." I said this to try and calm her, and with some resentment because I'm actually from Hakanita, to the north, but nobody knows where Hakanita is. This immediately felt like a stupid thing to have said. "Santa Fe?" she sneered, as though to say, who would ever want to be from there? "New Mexico?" I said. "What is that?" She slitted her eyes and stood up straighter. The gauzy robe became thick as curtains in a Holiday Inn. We were talking as though in a dream. The words didn't make sense, but the act of talking while we looked at one another conveyed worlds. "I'm human," I said with pride and some force, but this seemed meaningless to her. "Who are you?" I asked, with an undertone of suspicion, as though to say, "I'm not the only abnormal one in this room, Sugar Lips." There was this powerful sexual competition going on that was making me think and talk like a teenager. "I am Luev." I swear, when she said her name, a violet bloom of perfumed mist wafted out from her lips at me and made my knees quiver. She tossed her hair and took a deep breath that made all her parts move around inside her robe. "Yow!" she screeched, letting out involuntary sounds as she tried to turn her head away from our staring and found she couldn't. Erotic delirium was fighting with raw fear as my blood took over another involuntary step toward her. My hand reached out to touch her all by itself. Touching the skin of her arm was like petting a wild animal. I couldn't tell what she would do, but I couldn't resist. As I watched, her hand involuntarily reached out to touch my face, lifting her breasts as her irises dilated and became deep purple in the darkness. The mental strangeness I felt was replaced by the safety and familiarity of pure sexual longing as we both began caressing one another. It was all like dreaming. We kissed, embraced, and as we did so, we began to float above the bed in slow motion. Without doing anything about it, we became naked and sexually unified, our faces so close that I could count her eyelashes. I wrapped my arms around her waist. For the longest time we barely moved, and then, In a slow, prolonged, recurring pulsation, we climaxed together, floating and turning slowly in the darkness of her room. When we climaxed, how can I describe it? I felt myself expanding until I thought I would burst. Except that as I expanded, I became more and more peaceful. I had the distinct image of being half of the entire solar system, and of her being the other half. Our knowing each other contained this vast but specific amount of space. We floated in the room like fish in an aquarium, embracing and drifting slowly in drunken warmth as the telepathy of alien intelligence vibrated between us. Her cat had been watching us from the edges of the room all along. As we floated along her hallway in our embrace, the cat stood beneath us looking up. "Meow, meow," it said. We turned our dream-drenched minds to the cat, and Luev looked in my eyes and said softly, "Meow." And by God, I said it back. I felt the silky air around my body was somehow full of protons or ions. Spirals of electric current passed around my skin like the smooth coils of a higher intelligence. At a certain point, I knew I was fading. I'd used up a huge amount of energy and knew I was going to fall asleep and that this would make me go back into my body. I also knew I had to find her again and needed some way of identifying this place so I could return. I don't think she knew this was actually happening. To her, it really was a dream. We had drifted onto the sofa in her living room. On a table, an unlit lamp stood, and a very finely carved little stone-white figure stood on top of the table. I fixed my attention on it. It had a moon glow like alabaster in the dim light coming from a large bay window. It looked like the medieval sculpture of a robed Irish saint with exaggerated eyes. I memorized it with all my strength, with the intent to return to it. It was the last thing before I opened my eyes. Luev. Journal entry. December 7th, 2004, 1:17 a.m. I followed the same procedure as before, got the buzzing feeling, and went out the back of my head. I passed through the darkness and then the sea of blue vapor waves that Monroe calls louche, while all the time visualizing the carved alabaster figure in my mind. Sure enough, I drifted over the cottage and landed in Luev's living room. Immediately, the sense of breathing an etheric hallucinogen began. The room began to pulse. She was sleeping, her face turned to the side, her hair spread over the pillow. I stood there looking around the room and noticed how the ceiling curved to meet the walls. I looked at the curves where the walls met the ceiling and noticed the lozenge-shaped bed. Everything was oval. I stood there for a while, completely motionless. Suddenly, she rose up out of her body. She recognized me right away, and an intense glow of happiness came over her. It manifested as a luminous bloom of rose light in her chest and flared suddenly to a passionate ruby-red jewel, then began to vanish. As this happened, a dense, dull white robe around her body diluted into a gauzy veil, and I saw her alien beauty again. This gauzy robe changed to hide her nakedness as the glow in her chest became a dusty rose light, and in her eyes an intelligence turned on like a light. We embraced, and a little shock of energy passed through us. The feeling at that moment wasn't really sexual, it was a direct energy meeting between us. We both laughed and became focused and still. "It's you," she said, with wonder and a big smile. "I've thought of you constantly since the other night," I gushed, shamelessly, with the spontaneous honesty that seemed to rule my emotions when out of body. "Yes, me too. It was so beautiful. I remembered you when I awoke. You disappeared." Chains of sparkling energy streamed through her mind with thoughts she wanted to say as she searched my eyes. I had to go back. Go back where? Home. Where's your home? In Santa Fe. I almost said Hakanita. "Oh, you told me before," she said vaguely so that I could tell. She thought she was dreaming. Do you know you're out of your body? As soon as a thought came into my mind, it communicated itself. She looked down at herself, and a question vibration came out of her. I had directed her awareness toward her sleeping figure on the bed. She looked, but didn't register anything out of the ordinary. I drifted over to her body and looked closely at her physical face so that she would look at her face. She leaned over and suddenly jumped back and gasped. Seeing her body scared her. "It's all right. Don't be scared," I said, and touched her shoulder. "What is this?" She looked between me and her sleeping body. "You are in your dream body, like me. We are outside our bodies." "I'm dreaming?" "No, you aren't dreaming. This is really happening." "You are outside your body? We are dreaming together?" she asked, baffled. "I'm outside my body, but I'm not dreaming. I chose to come here tonight, to see you." Her body on the bed writhed and moaned. Her energy body sort of flickered. I reached out and touched her arm. I didn't want her to go. "What do you do?" I said, groping for some way to start a conversation with her. "What do you eat?" "I work at an architectural firm." She was looking around her bedroom in amazement. "I'm an architect," she said distractedly. This answer surprised me. "I'm not dreaming," she said. We were both getting that it didn't really matter what was said, only that we relate to one another, second by second. We sort of solidified on the floor and walked into the next room. Her robe, which had been momentarily transparent, became opaque. I noticed that I was dressed similarly, in a vaguely whitish robe that went to my ankles. I realized that these weren't clothes, but shields of awareness. There was a short hall that branched into different rooms. We walked into a large room with a couch and an oval coffee table. There were papers on the table and floor with the Cyrillic letters I had seen on the laptop keyboards at the cafe. "What is this?" I nodded at the papers. "It is letters to people about the depleted food." I could tell that she, too, was being transparently honest. "You're writing about food?" "Yes, the food makes people sick because of the chemicals." She plunged suddenly into a depth of despairing emotion. My heart lurched inside my chest in response to this sudden shift. It was almost like she was suddenly dying right before my eyes. Her energy had become heavy and sad. With a great effort, she continued, her voice so soft I could barely hear her. "And the river water is causing birth deformities to babies. I belong to a group," she said, now carefully measuring her words. "It's called the Siddhe. We are trying to educate people about the Fall, the suicide sickness." She turned her eyes to me. Intense bright lines of thought pierced through the gloom that had overtaken her mind and sliced like razor blades into my own mind. "Are you an angel?" she said, looking straight into my eyes. "Can you stop the Fall?" Her eyes lit up wildly as she stared at me. I just kept watching her. She seemed very unstable, and I was afraid something terrible was about to happen. "We are fighting the Skandir government that produces deformed food. This weakens people. They can't renew their vitality and want to go to the stars. And something has entered the drinking water, some substance that no one can identify. It causes the deformities in babies. Everyone is so sad about these things. The suicides." She began talking very fast. Intense line of mental energy were fighting the heavy, sucking weight of her emotions. A brown glob of energy appeared in her middle, out of which a maroon ink began to spill down her chest. "Maybe you are an angel?" She reached for me suddenly, desperately, tears streaming down her face. Her mental lines were shooting such intense, sharp trajectories into me that they hurt. She desperately wanted me to be an angel, and I was afraid that to disappoint her would actually hurt her. "I am a human," I said slowly, and reached out to touch her. She was desperately afraid of her own emotions and was trying to get away from them in her mind, as though they were deadly microbes. "Human? Like Hanamunan?" I didn't know what she meant. "I'm human, from the earth." I stroked the curve of her waist. Her feverish eyes contracted with astonishment. Her energy shifted. Her mind cut through the emotional suck of her sadness, and she looked at me with renewed self-possession. Her robes began to vaporize. "A Hanamunan? From Earth? You are Terran?" She became electrified. "What is that?" I said. The currents of energy that had already passed between us had created a deep sense of trust. We felt one another's alienness, but now as a benevolent force, and we sought the comfort and upliftment we knew this contained. We embraced our nakedness, distracted her. Our nakedness distracted her from the depressing emotions. We made love against the pain of her sadness and against my own loneliness. We became possessive and soul-hungry. When we climaxed, it was like an emotional orgasm that made me sob uncontrollably. I began to black out. When I knew I was going to fade, I said, "Don't let us get separated." She hugged me fiercely. "I am here," she said, her cheek against mine. We clutched at each other. I wanted to take her home with me, and as soon as that thought went through my mind, we began to float up and out of her house. In a flash, we passed through the timeless place of blue waves, and then we were in my bedroom, standing at the foot of my bed. We were still hugging, still naked, still crying. "What is this?" She wiped at her tears with her fingers and looked around my room. She stared at the green, bubbling fish tank in horror, becoming really nervous at this change of place. She pulled away from me to look around her, and her robe became thick. The different feel of the human dimension startled her, and she almost vanished right there. I touched her arm gently, looking at her in all her strangeness as she turned away, taking in my room. The lines of her long, curving hips were so lovely I felt compelled to stroke them. I started to run my hands down along her hips when she whipped around and slapped me in the face so hard that my neck popped. "Oh, sorry," she said and laughed. "I thought you were someone else." She leaned out and stroked the cheek she'd slapped and smiled so sweetly I almost forgot what had just happened. She was feeling the basic atomic difference of this dimension and felt disoriented, I explained to myself. She felt different to herself, and this explained something to me about how I felt like a different me over there. "This is my house in Hakanita," I said, as I watched this exotic entity from another dimension standing at the foot of my bed while I was in my dream body. I was near the ceiling of my ability to process the experience and was taking fast, shallow breaths like I've seen Yvonne do to calm her anger. I was trying to act calm so that the dream woman wouldn't get scared and split. The pane window looking out on the backyard attracted her. Neutron was sleeping half out of his old doghouse. "It's too small for him, but I built another one, but he won't use it." "Galabala," Luev said on seeing Neutron. She turned smiling at me and said aloud, "Fis guelda," or something like that. I think it meant, "Holy moly, you have a dog." We walked through the kitchen, the living room, the extra bedroom beyond it that I use as a workshop. "That's my radio," I said. "That's a model of a Spitfire. That's a Dremel. That's a glue gun. That's my guitar. That's my grandfather's violin," I said, pointing to tools and the instruments hanging on the wall, trying to keep things chatty. "Ixtellar," she said, reaching out and touching the violin. "I play too," she said proudly. I was about to ask what she meant when she turned and asked, "Where's the rock that you said is like the one at my house?" "Oh, that's at my friend's house," I said. Suddenly, I wanted her to see the rock, for her to know this link between us. I took her hands, clicked my heels. No, actually, I visualized Lena's garden, and zoom, we were there under the towering boulder with a knob of quartz on it. "That's it. That's my rock," Luev said, and looked around at Spencer and Lena's house. The alien juniper and pinon trees growing up the slope of the hill, the different kind of soil. "Oh, I'm getting dizzy," she said. "I need to go back to sleep. I have to go back." Suddenly, she was afraid. Her energy dipped. "I need to go home now." She gave me a dark look as though I could be dangerous, so I thought it best to let her go. I started to explain how I went out the back of my head and then through the hole into the blue energy field, but seeing her flickering form and sensing her growing fear, I realized it was too complicated an explanation. I remembered Monroe saying that all you had to do to return from the astral was to move any part of your physical body consciously. "Just move your fingers," I said. She stared at me, uncomprehending. "Try and move your fingers," I said softly. She was staring at me one moment, and the next she'd vanished. 2 or 3 times I've gone out the back of my head and found Luev's house, but conditions weren't right for an encounter. Once she was still up, walking around the house in her normal body, doing the dishes, feeding her cat, and couldn't see me. This was very frustrating. I was more and more gaining the ability to be rational while knowing I was in a dream state. So that, as I hovered there outside her window like a peeping Tom from another planet, watching this beauty wearing loose knitted pants and a sort of jersey with floppy lapels, moving around her kitchen, doing completely mundane practical things, I was looking at the experience objectively and wondering at this shift of consciousness continuing to happen to me. Twice she wasn't there, the bed was empty. I did wonder jealously if she had someone else because of the slapping incident. Other times I couldn't get out of body when I tried. Twice I've gone out the back of my head and just ended up under the bed. Once I flew to Yvonne's house and tried to pinch her to see if she would remember it, but Yvonne sleeps like a log. And there were dreams. One night I dreamt of very tall people in white robes walking around me. They were very powerful, wise beings from another place. We walked on a path of blue flagstones. It was like walking underwater. The path began to tilt up, and then we were walking on thin air, up and away from a little round planet and towards another little round planet that was very close. Journal entry. December 13th, 2004, 12:25 a.m. When I got to Luev's house, she was already out of her body and floating in the living room. "I did it," she said. I telepathically knew she meant she had got out of body by herself. "This is the 3rd time." So now she knew that this wasn't a dream, and she knew I wasn't a dream. An intense suspense I've been living with concerning the reality of my encounters with her was eased by her coming to this realization. OBE experiences are just as much a new thing to her as to me. She really is my friend in this place out of time. If I'm crazy, at least I have a friend in my delusion. She told me she had been flying around her neighborhood and projected pictures of her travels to me. As we stared into each other's eyes, I changed somehow. Being out of body became more real to me. She became more real to me. Popping and squirting sensations started in my brain. What can I say? Her gauzy robes began to evaporate. How can I ever show this to Yvonne? I'm reading Monroe's 2nd book, Far Journey. He knew about everything I'm experiencing. Met with Luev, we equalized energies by embracing and feeling the electrical shock of contact. We then exchanged rotes. This is a term of Monroe's. He invented a language to describe the experiences that happen in the astral, especially the speed at which things happen there. A rote is a unit of information transferred directly from mind to mind. This can be directly transmitted in pictures and words by focusing and intending it. Monroe calls this scrolling through a rote. I flashed this technique to Luev, and she used it to transmit some hard information. I learned that Luev lives in the city of Sala, in the region of Dag, in the country of Aranskala, which is one of the great population and cultural centers of Ovvala. It's like Paris by the Seine in France, or like Greenwich Village in New York in America. I learned that in Ovvala there is a royal lineage called the Skandir that has global control of agriculture and industry and is centered in Ostrad and Vologa, across an ocean from Aranskala, her country. The Skandir royalty slowly came to power over the last 1,000 years as it took over power from the more ancient lineage of the Siddhe, who are remembered in Aranskala as a highly artistic and benevolent royal lineage who were in power before the Skandir. The Skandir language is intermarried with most. The Skandir lineage is intermarried with most of the families that own most of the land on Ovvala. It sounds like how the royal houses of Europe at the turn of the last century were all intermarried. Loew went into more detail about something called the Fall. This is an epidemic of suicidal depression that is rampant all over the planet. It's caused by a collective energy leak among Ovvalans in general. Loew couldn't explain it. She seems nervous even talking about it very much. She had an older brother she was very close to named Duram, who committed suicide because of this condition. Recalling his death made Loew very sad and heavy-hearted. When I've felt her emotions sag like this, it's a little scary. The foul disease began fairly recently, like in the last half-century or so. It grew into an epidemic as the biological decay of the land got worse. Over the last century, the Skandir government introduced mechanical agriculture. This is an artificial process that Loew's activism group, the Siddhe, thinks is part of what causes the fall. But the fall is also a kind of spiritual depression, giving up hope, losing interest in life. There is a global media network owned by the Skandir that, with its allies around the planet, broadcasts the same news. It seems to amount to an industrial hierarchy broadcasting propaganda. Skandir mass communications don't discuss the daily suicides that happen in office buildings, on construction sites, on college campuses, or in private homes, so that the greater mass of society is in the dark about the extent of the problem. When a suicide happens in public, the media attributes it to drug overdoses or assassinations by terrorists. Meeting me has registered in a serious way with Loew. She doesn't understand it any more than I do, but she has lived with the fear of contracting the fall just like her brother. Meeting me has given her hope. There is an issue that makes Loew physically sick to discuss. It's about deformed babies, and it has something to do with the river Ul that runs through Dag. Most of these deformities seem to be happening in connection with this water. This is something the Skandir-owned media also won't report on. Only recently, in the last few decades, has there been electrical power on Ovvala. This power appeared along with the food processing factories. The birth deformities began occurring at about the same time this power became available, so the Sura believe there is a connection. The Sura are doing mass mailings to encourage people to grow their own food, purify their water, and not listen to the misinformation. The Sura is one of hundreds of such groups in Iran Scala that is doing such work. They are also encouraging people to form Sura collectives so as to try and separate news from propaganda. There's an underground group that calls itself the Siddhe in memory of the kings and queens of Ovala's golden era. It broadcasts information clips from secret locations that the Skandir can't always block. The most recent of these broadcasts was about how the Sura is collecting water from various rivers to try and track where the poison is coming from. They also discuss the Fall and encourage people to grow home gardens to supplement their daily food. They tell people that the Skandirs need to be resisted to protect the vitality of life. The idea of the ancient Siddhe plays a big part in the mythology of Dag culture. Loew makes a lot of references to this. This original Siddhe included the existence of the Hanamunan. Loew thought it was one of these. Loew thought I was one of these the first time we encountered. In Dag mythology, Hanamunans were magical beings from another world, but over time and through Skandir influence they became evil trolls and the doors closed. The existence of this ancient mythical world is honored in Dag culture by spelling words with double letters to represent a double word. a practice the Skandir rulers denounce as superstitious and sentimental, and in reaction to which they doubled the R in their own name. Luev showed me a world map of Ovvala, and I was astounded to see that the continents are exactly like those of Earth. The vast majority of the countries on the continents of Ovvala live agrarian lifestyles, something that is held in very high esteem by Dog culture as well as other Ovvalan cultures around the planet. Growing and eating food is the basis of a kind of cosmic religion to Ovvalans. When I communicated to Luev how I felt her become so deeply sad at times, she told me that this isn't peculiar to her but is common to all Ovvalans. Happiness and friendliness are the only things that give living any value to Ovvalans. Ovvalans aren't materialistic and have a need to feel etheric radiance constantly in order to feel happy. They hunger for the same radiance that makes plants thrive, something called An, that is believed to exist in the air and enter plants. Being deprived of An, she believes, causes the Fall. When someone goes beyond a certain point of sadness, they can't get back to vitality again, and they want to stop living. The expression is that they want to go to the sky. Hundreds of thousands of Ovvalans, maybe millions, have the foul sickness. She thinks 1,000 people commit suicide a month. I think Luev fears having it herself, which is why she devotes so much of her time to the work of the Surah. The government issues drugs that are supposed to counteract the foul, but nothing really seems to work. Seeing drugged semi-catatonic zombies walking around just depresses other Ovvalans and causes the foul to start in them. The flying discs are called Skalin. They look just like standard pictures of UFOs in our regular cars in Ovvala. They have existed for hundreds of years. The particular atmospheric magnetism of Ovvala seems to make them possible. They run on anti-magnetics produced by a crystal-generated force called Kavra. She took me out to her driveway and we sat in hers. She was frustrated that she couldn't start it and take me for a ride. It comes as a perk with her job. Dog Ovvalans prefer to watch large community video screens rather than sit at home and watch television alone, so that there are group viewing rooms in most neighborhoods where people go to watch together. Even in cities, people watch broadcasts in theaters. Now, with the new phenomenon of laptops and an internet, which only appeared about a decade ago, more people are watching non-governmental broadcasts. Only the people who accept the Skandir vision of events still go to the public viewings. When I've gone looking for Luev and not found her, I've flown around in her neighborhood or gone into some homes and watched the people interact. I went into Sala and walked around on the sidewalks with the nighttime crowds or strolled through factories and watched people canning vegetables. Except for the difference in the general look of things, the oval desks, light fixtures, doorways, and people's physical movements and the pointed ears, Ovvalans are no different than humans, walking and working. Yet the physicality of Ovvalans is different than ours. I can't compare them to anything I can think of. Their logic is different, and they are very emotional. I'm getting this partly from Luev telling me things, partly from the feelings I get from being with her, and the feel of people when she takes me to different places. We visited her parents in their home outside Sala. Her father's name is Barntold, and her mother's is Mier. He was sitting in an armchair reading, and she was talking on a phone. He is a large man, getting portly, black hair, long Ovvalan face with jowls. He looks kind of like a big version of Elvis Costello with pointy ears. The mother has light hair and is pretty, still has a nice figure. She reminded me of a movie star from the 50s, June Allison, but with pointy ears. I felt like we were intruding and didn't want to stay too long. Luev thought the experience was hilarious. She tried to pinch her dad to get his attention, but he just kept right on reading. I get flash impressions of how Ovvalans are different than humans. There is a ray of hope that extends out of the Ovvalan heart towards some universal center. I can sometimes see this green ray extend out of people's chests. It is like a blind trust in goodness. They are like children in this way. This is a kind of emotional need that compulsively and constantly seeks confirmation from others and from the universe in general. Is everything okay? Is everything okay? Their energy seems to ask. When this resonance is not felt, their heart crumples. Ovvalans are emotionally transparent. You see this all just by looking at them. But what is Ovvala? Is it a physical place? An energy place? Luev and I are meeting out of body, so that's an energy place, but where is her physical body? The Bats character I talked to at the market in Sala said this is a world in another frequency. What does this mean? A fundamental dog value, at least in Sala, where Luev comes from, is that food is cosmic energy. There are two parts to food, the physical nourishment and the spirit force called Ah. This cosmic energy exists in food, in air, and in water, and can't be owned. There's a special kind of money to provide for births, for medical care, for education, for burials. The cost of the spiritual passages in life are shared by society. This is thought to elevate all of society. People get paid a different kind of money or credit for working. Accumulating vouchers for everyday needs is a depressing absurdity in the anti-Skandir Dag psyche. Most Dag Ovvalans are anti-Skandir. The main pro-Skandir areas are called Vologa and Ostrad. The Skandir create laws and regulations attached to the transmission of the vitality, something that is considered a hateful practice by dogs in general. Luev and her friends in the Sura believe the Skandir are trying to control the actual enthusiasm of life. The Balotek is a ministry of the Skandir royalty which controls education and information, but which everyone knows is the basis of the manipulation of society. The many people belonging to the Sura feel that the educational system encourages unconsciousness and servitude. We went flying in our astral bodies over Sala. Luev showed me the building where she works. She showed me her office and sat at her drawing board laughing that she was in her astral body. We were on the 11th floor. UFOs were flying by regularly right outside the windows. She didn't look up once. On Earth, those ships are a great mystery, I told Luev. Many people have seen them, but many more have not. Most people think the beings inside the UFOs are from outer space, from some other solar system. We both found this very interesting, wondering what it could mean. Belief in the reality of the discs has become a kind of psychological boundary between humans, I told her. I tried to relay to her the idea that at one time some humans thought the Earth was flat and others thought it was round as a kind of measure of how human consciousness once leaped, and how UFOs represent the same kind of shift today. Earth is round? She was amazed. Well, yeah, isn't Ovvala round? No, it's oval, she said, and laughed. I didn't get it. We drifted out into the suburbs of Sala and came to an orchard where the trees were all planted in rows. We landed there and walked between the rows of leafless, dormant trees. Frozen pears lay on the ground, so that I knew it was a pear orchard. Pears, I said, looking at the browned pears lying among the leaves. Undas? You say pars? Yes, pears, I said. Suddenly, we were both jolted by a wave of intense energy. It was like having an orgasm for no reason at all. We both laughed out loud and were magnetized up into the air and back to her house. We landed in her front yard by the boulder. We stood there stunned for a moment, and then, out of the blue, Luev said, "Let's each plant an unda tree right here." Luev stomped her foot down about 10 feet in front of the boulder, right in front of the crystal. I'll plant a tree here in my yard, and you plant one at your friend's house in the exact same place on Earth. Would your friends let you plant a tree on their land?" "I'm sure they would," I said, and woke up.